right, Psalm chapter 1. Might be a familiar psalm, or at least some very familiar sounding sentiments that we'll read here. Blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor standeth in the way of sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of the scornful. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law doth he meditate day and night. And he shall be like a tree planted by the rivers of water, that bringeth forth his fruit in his season. His leaf also shall not wither, and whatsoever he doeth shall prosper. The ungodly are not so, but are like the chaff which the wind driveth away. Therefore the ungodly shall not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. For the Lord knoweth the way of the righteous, but the way of the ungodly shall perish. I have a commentary that I would like to read with introducing the psalm. This commentary of many years past, I think he wrote probably during the 1700s. But he says this is a psalm of instruction concerning good and evil, setting before us life and death, the blessing and the curse, that we may take the right way which leads to happiness and avoid that which will certainly end in our misery and ruin. The different character and condition of godly people and wicked people, those that serve God and those that serve Him not, is here plainly stated in a few words, so that every man, if he will be faithful to himself, may here see his own face and then read his own doom. That division of the children of men into saints and sinners, righteous and unrighteous, the children of God and the children of the wicked one, as it is ancient ever since the struggle began between sin and grace, the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent, so it is lasting and will survive all other divisions and subdivisions of men into high and low, rich and poor, bond and free. For by this men's everlasting state will be determined, and the distinction will last as long as heaven and hell. I was thinking about Psalm 1, and when I read that commentary, I just thought it even further, more pointedly, cemented in my heart that was a good introduction to resume our study. We've been entertaining the question and trying to make it very personal. Are you ready? Again, asking myself, I need to say, am I ready? Well, ready for what? Ready for this distinction that the commentator says we see so readily and so distinctly here in Psalm chapter 1. He said this is instruction between the good and bad, between the righteous and the unrighteous, between the godly and the ungodly. And as he asserted, he said, this is ancient. It's found in the middle of our Bibles, but it goes all the way back to the beginning when sin was first entered into humanity in the garden. But it will also last forever. As the commentator said, this is the distinction that each of us needs to give our greatest attention to. As we had pointed out in our introductory lesson, friends, one of the things we need to recognize is these two groups identified in the challenge, living godly and ungodly world, those are the only two groups of which you can belong. And that's what the psalm is pointing out. The blessedness of those who are godly and the curse belonging to those who are ungodly. Again, every one of us belongs to one of those groups. And which group we belong to has eternal consequences. Eternal. That's why we suggested the thing we need to recognize is just how fundamental this challenge is. This is the challenge of life. The challenge. All other challenges that we might encounter spiritually are just a subdivision of this one. Living godly in an ungodly world. It is, as I suggested, the spiritual construct for living this life. It is the framework. And not just for us, but for every generation. Hopefully, having recognized that, and then particularly calling attention to who the godly are today. From 1 Timothy chapter 3, even though this has been a distinction that has always existed and always will among men, today, in the Christian era, it has specific parameters. The godly today are those who are in Christ Jesus. The godly today are New Testament Christians. As 1 Timothy 3 and verse 15 identifies us, we are those who belong to the household of God, which is the church of the living God, and we are those, the godly, who are living, behaving as we should, faithful, obedient children of God. That and that alone are the godly today. All others belong to this group. And so with those fundamental truths with regards to recognition as it pertains to this challenge, then we particularly entered into this question, are you ready? Am I ready? If we are going to be ready to meet and conquer and overcome this challenge, if we are successfully going to live godly in an ungodly world, yes, we must recognize those things, but then we must possess a great resolve, a determination, a fixed, unwavering determination to live among the godly. A determination, a resolve that we saw in people like Daniel and people like Joseph. Not the kind of resolve that too often characterize New Year resolutions. No. Those too often we make, but don't keep. And friends, there is a difference between making a resolution and keeping one. And Jesus so well illustrated that as far as its spiritual applications when He taught the parable of the soils. Because of the three that gave forth life, two of those three never brought forth fruit, never yielded eternal benefits. Why? A lack of resolve. They did not have enough determination to live godly in an ungodly world. And therefore, when persecution arose, when affliction came, when the cares of this life, when the pleasures and lusts of this world in which we live, when they beckoned or when they impacted their lives, they gave up. They surrendered. A lack of resolve. It will demand great resolve. The last time we were together, we suggested another R in Are You Ready? If we are going to successfully live godly in an ungodly world, we're going to have to resist. Resolve, yes, but we need to resist. And particularly, as we identified last week, we need to resist the devil. James chapter 4, verse 7 states it in those very words. We have to resist the devil. Remember, he's the one leading the spiritual forces. He's the one who is the God of the ungodly. And therefore, he's the one that is leading this assault, this opposition against those of us who are in the minority, who are, as the godly, trying to live godly in this ungodly world. And yet he is opposing us. He's our enemy. He's our adversary. And so he's leading the assault. And therefore, as James says, we must resist him. The significance of that word, as we called attention to last week, was literally stand against. Brother Wood said this was a military term. And it spoke to those who were in battle array, who stood against the enemy. And in its application, obviously, as Christian soldiers, we must be in battle array. We must stand against. We must resist the enemy on every front. Every front. And it must be a constant. It must be a ever vigilant resistance. Why? Because Peter will use the same word with regards to how we need to resist the devil over in 1 Peter chapter 5, and there he will use it not in the context of warfare, but in the context of the animal kingdom and as a lion. The devil, our enemy, is prowling, walking about, seeking whom he may devour, destroy. Hence, Paul or Peter says, be sober, be vigilant, resist him. You have to stand against him. Ever be mentally alert. Ever be on guard. And as I suggested, those imageries that are given to us in James 4, 1 Peter chapter 5, calling upon Christians to resist as a soldier in battle, as a potential prey in an African savanna, it all speaks to how this is a matter of life and death. If we don't resist, we will be taken captive by the enemy. If we don't resist, the enemy will overcome us. He will devour us. Constant resistance. And that has practical applications. In fact, I would suggest it is touching every area of our lives. How do we know that? Well, we looked at James chapter 4, and there is, even within that chapter, a number of applications that we could apply. And what we see is that as we resist the devil, what we are actually doing is trying to resist his efforts to have us conform to the ungodly world. All the things we are needing to resist is because that is his area wherein he is trying to get us to conform to the world's standards. And so I suggested this need for resisting principally comes down to this. Friends, if we're going to be successful in meeting the challenge of living godly in an ungodly world, we are going to have to resist the devil's trying to squeeze us into the world's mold. And he does that again in every area of our lives. That is what Romans chapter 12 and verse 2 urges us to do. Be not conformed to this world. Don't allow the enemy. Stand against him, lest he fashion you into the ungodly world in which we live. And again, that touches every area of our lives. And that's why it is something that we must constantly, ever vigilantly be doing, resisting, standing against him. Because he's trying to conform the godly to think and to act like the world. He's trying to get us to conform to the world's values, its morals, its behaviors, its attitudes toward everything that we deal with in life. Now, hopefully, this study with regards to the term resist helps us capture the need for us never to compromise. Literally stand against the devil in his efforts to get us to conform to this world. But before we move on, I want to call your attention to some other language that we find in the Bible that I believe further substantiates this need to never capitulate, never compromise. And I just think the language is so telling because it is language that we discover wherein the Bible is urging us to have this kind of attitude toward temptation to become like the world. And so, if you want to join with me, we're not going to spend much time at all on talking about these verses. I just want you to see the language that, much like resist, should impress upon us just how diligent we need to be and how steadfast in standing against the enemy. There can be no room for compromise. So, I'll begin in 1 Peter 2 and verse 11. 1 Peter 2 and verse 11, dearly beloved, I beseech you as strangers and pilgrims. Again, there's the idea. We are the minority. We are a godly people trying to live in an ungodly world. We are just passing through. We're just strangers. This environment in which we live is not our home, not our true home. So we're strangers, we're pilgrims, but watch. Abstain from fleshly lusts which war against them. The soul. Abstain. What does that mean? You know, it's very unpopular today, especially in our culture of sexual freedom. But you remember when abstinence was encouraged among young people? What did that mean? Do not have sexual relations until you are married. Abstinence. Because it means to keep away from. It literally means to refrain deliberately. And I appreciated this part of the definition, and often with an effort of self-denial from some action. It is to hold oneself back from. That's the word that Peter says needs to constitute our attitude toward fleshly lust. We need to hold ourselves back from them. Keep away from them. Even more generally applied, 1 Thessalonians 5:22 uses the word again. Abstain from all appearance of evil. Keep yourself back from it. Stand against it. What about Ephesians 5:11? Look over there. We had some readings out of Ephesians 5. It's a practical chapter. Ephesians chapter 5 this morning in our Bible class as it relates to thankfulness, but look at Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 11. And it would be great for us to be able to read through much of this context to better grasp what he's saying. But just listen to verse 11. Have no fellowship. That's pretty definitive, isn't it? No fellowship. Fellowship means participation. In fact, he's going to use that word back in verse 7. Be not ye therefore partakers with them. Have no fellowship. Have no communion. With what? The unfruitful works of darkness. The ungodly world. Reprove it. Stand against it. But don't have any participation with it. Don't have any fellowship with it. What about the word flee? Twice we encounter that. 2 Timothy 2 and verse 22, Paul's counsel to the younger Timothy is flee also youthful lusts. When you think of fleeing from something, Ricky, what are you doing? You're running away from it, right? You're not getting closer. Fleeing fornication. You're running from it. Youthful lust. 1 Corinthians 6, verse 18, flee fornication. And doesn't our minds take us back to Joseph? Joseph, whose resolve is commendable, exemplary. Why? Because he says, I cannot do it. Potiphar's wife, I cannot. Daily she seduced him. Daily she urged him to have sexual relations with him. And he said, I cannot. And so when she physically tried to restrain him, what does he do? He flees. He's running away. That's what, as Christians, we are called upon to do to the enemy who is trying to conform us to this world. And then this one, not from the New Testament, from the Old. I want us to look at this, please. Proverbs chapter 4, please. Proverbs chapter 4. There are some great passages in the Proverbs, especially the early chapters, that really deal with this subject of the need to resist. But possibly none are more pointed with regards to this particular point that we're making than Proverbs chapter 4. Proverbs chapter 4. And please understand, this comes in the context of Solomon urging his children, and maybe, by broader application, all the children of Israel. He's urging them to seek wisdom. And remember where wisdom begins? The fear of the Lord. What is godliness? Fear of the Lord. He's urging them to be godly. Accept wisdom. Allow wisdom to direct you. It is in this context that he says, verse 7, wisdom is the principal thing. Therefore, get wisdom. What does that entail? What will that involve? Look at verse 14. Enter not into the path of the wicked. Does that sound like Psalm 1? Blessed is the man that stands not in the counsel or sits not in the counsel of the ungodly. He doesn't stand with sinners. And so here is Solomon saying, don't enter into the path of the wicked. But that's not enough. Don't go in the way of evil men. Well, you know what? I can go up and kind of look in the window. And I haven't gone in, right? That's his counsel, go not in. Just to make sure his children didn't understand that, he says, avoid it. Pass not by it. Turn from it and pass away. Ricky, this is not seeing how close I can get and not go in. Solomon says, you need to get away from it. You need to turn. You don't even need to pass by it. See, that's the language that speaks to this resistance, standing against. There can be no compromise. There can be no indifference to it. It must be no fellowship. It must be fleeing from it, abstaining from it. Don't even get close to it. Now, when we were together the last time, I told you this has always been true. And again, that's one of the reasons I wanted to read Psalm 1. I wanted to read that commentator because that's what he was saying. This psalm, picturing the godly trying to live among the ungodly, that's always been true. From the beginning of man's history, since sin was entered into the world, to the end, and it will go on into eternity. These are the only two groups. And so, like I said, this has always been that framework. And so there's always been a need to resist. If we're going to meet this challenge, if we're going to live godly in an ungodly world, there is need to resist. That being the case, I wanted to suggest and give note to a particular element or a dynamic or a factor, whatever word you want to use to identify it, of our current ungodly world that I think speaks to even an amplified degree of the need to resist. And I can give you a visual aid. It's this right here. Friends, this handheld computer that accompanies us, most of us, everywhere we go. It gives the ungodly world access into my private life anytime I allow it to. Now, having brought this out, let me acknowledge something about most technological advancements. They usually offer some constructive uses. I got to tell you, and I think I've shared this with you before, I was resistant. I didn't want to get one. But then my children would rather text me than talk to me for some reason. I mean, they were brought up with this technology, and I don't know, but they're just infatuated with being able to throw an emoji in there, I guess. I don't know what it is. But anyways, they would rather text than talk, and I found out on a flip phone, you can't text and have a conversation. I mean, by the time you finish your text, there are three subjects on, So I gave in. All right. And now that I have one, I got to tell you, I delight in the Bible apps that it affords me. Maybe some of you folks remember when I used to bring that box in, Tracy. Well, it broke down for the second time because I had 100 pounds of books in there carrying. You know what? I don't need that anymore. I read from a commentator that 5 years ago, I would have had to bring the book in. Now it's here. So I'm not going to lie to you. I appreciate some of the advancements that technology has granted us, some of the conveniences. And especially, again, for me, these Bible apps that I have at my fingertips. Having said that, I hope we would never be blinded to the potential danger and destruction that most modern technology offers and threatens us with. Again, friends, this modern technology opens the world's allurements into my heart, into my mind. This little electronic gadget with its innumerable websites, its unsolicited advertisements, the myriad of social media platforms, it allows the ungodly world to enter into my private life. Apart, away from, shielded from my family, from my friends, from my brethren. And for us to deny the possibility, the potential for its significance and its dangerous influences, I believe, is naive. I believe we only deceive ourselves. One we will not deceive is God. The Bible is very clear. Be not deceived. God isn't mocked. Now, we might deceive ourselves. We might deceive our family. We're not going to deceive God. God is not mocked. Whatsoever man soweth, that shall he reap. He that sows to the flesh shall of the flesh reap corruption. He that soweth to the Spirit shall of the Spirit reap everlasting. I just never want us to be deceived to the reality that the images that this gadget keeps before us, the speech that it resounds with on its countless posts, and then the attitudes that are exhibited in the images along with the posts can be so destructive. So destructive. The Bible cautions us about giving the enemy, the devil, an advantage. And in that context, it says, 2 Corinthians 2 and verse 11, lest Satan should get an advantage over us. Now notice how we don't allow him to do that. We are not ignorant of his devices. Friends, we give the enemy an advantage if we deny that this is a device that Satan can and will use to make the challenge of living godly in an ungodly world all the more difficult. We give him the advantage. Now, I feel certain that those who are assembled here today are among the godly. I think all of us here want to rise victorious over this challenge. I would even go further to say I believe all of us present are well aware of this modern day difficulty that previous generations didn't have to deal with. We do. I think all of us would recognize those things. And so I know I'm not revealing anything to you. I know this isn't some kind of revelation. No. all I'm urging us to do is, starting with myself and asking your thoughtful consideration to it, sometimes by means of this handheld computer, may I suggest, I believe instead of resisting the devil, we're actually inviting him in to our lives. And so, if it's ever been or if it is a problem for you, and I will be the first to confess it's been a problem for me. If it is, if it has been, I urge you to hear Jesus' counsel. Counsel that is offered in very poignant, figurative language that is no doubt designed to almost shock us into the recognition that we need to take whatever steps are necessary to resist the devil in general, yes, but to resist this potential hindrance and obstacle to our meeting the challenge. And so I leave you with that counsel. Here's what Jesus says. If your right eye offends you, pluck it out. Cast it from you. For it is profitable for thee that one of your members should perish, and not that your whole body should be cast into hell. And if your right hand offend thee, cut it off, cast it from you. For it is profitable for thee that one of your members should perish, and not that your whole body should be cast into hell. Now, like I said, friends, that has to be figurative because physical amputation does not have any bearing on sin. But the fact that Jesus would issue that counsel after talking about heart adultery, about the possibility of lusting in your heart, no doubt what he is counseling us is, take whatever steps are necessary. Whatever is necessary. To avoid allowing this or any other device by the enemy to get us to quit resisting, to have us yielding, to allure us away from that battlefront, that standing in battle array against the enemy. A constant need to resist. We didn't get to the next one. Lord willing, next week we'll add another R to Are You Ready? But I did think this was important enough for us to give attention to. Because again, it speaks to one of the ways in which in our present society and culture and advanced technology that we're going to have to resist. And like I said, I don't think any here were not aware of that, but I just call special attention to it because it can very easily allow the world into our lives, even in our efforts to resist. Psalm 1, again, presents to us the only two groups of people that you can be part of. There's a blessing for one, there's a cursing for the other. The blessing belongs to the godly, the cursing to the ungodly. Each of us as an individual must decide which one I'm going to belong to. Now, hearing blessing and cursing, you would think most would choose the blessing. And yet, the human narrative, our own experience, tells us most actually choose the cursing. We can't allow the majority to influence our choice. Let's choose to be among the blessed. Let's choose to be among the godly, with all the promises, trusting God that they are true. and that this is just a brief sojourn that we must go through this ungodly world until we enjoy the ultimate blessing of eternal communion and fellowship with Him and with all the godly in that heavenly home. So, if you are watching and you have never entered among the godly, again, today, that is exclusively New Testament Christians. That is exclusively those belonging to the Church of Christ, God's household today. And so if you're not a member of that, if you have questions as to how to do that, if you know that it demands obeying the gospel, which essentially is confessing your faith, believing in your heart that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, willingness to die to sin so that now you can follow Him, and then showing your willingness to obey, humbly be baptized for the forgiveness of your sins, confessing your faith in Him, so that you might enter into the church, might enter into the household of God, become a son or daughter, a New Testament Christian, be numbered among the godly.